Hello everyone, so in this lecture video we're going to be talking about the spinal nerve, the spinal cord, and in this case some major reflexes, okay, and how to classify reflexes. So the spinal nerves are known as spinal nerves because they actually exit from the spinal cord, and they're named normally after the type of vertebra that they exit from. Now we probably didn't cover this, but there are three types of vertebra. Most of the time you have the cervical vertebra, the thoracic vertebra, and the lumbar vertebra, as well as there are vertebrae that are fused together in the sacrum in this case, all right? And the coccyx is the last determination of the actual spinal, in this case, column, okay? So their name, depending on which region they come out from. So 31 pairs again. So they can be named. So there are actually 4 bundles of nerves that actually come out from 4 distinct regions. The cervical plexus is a bundle of nerves that comes out in the neck area. The brachial plexus is the plexus that actually supplies the nerves to the arms in this case. And then we actually have the sacral plexus and the lumbar plexus that actually together supplies nerves to the legs, to the lower regions, all right? So that's where the spinal nerves come from. So the spinal cord, if in this case, this section, as you know, is a transverse section, okay? There are multiple neurons, and the neurons that actually are inside the spinal cord can be classified based on their function, okay? And again, this is going back to the functional divisions of the central nervous system. If you look at it, so we have white and gray matter, again, okay, typical, just like what we have in the brain. And again, please note that gray means to say that there's no myelin, and white means there's tons and tons of myelin. Okay, and please again remember that gray means central processing unit. A damage to gray matter is much more major than a damage to the white matter, which is the wiring of the nervous system. Okay, so here, if you look at this one, folks, the posterior, so this is the posterior portion, and the reason why you can tell that that's the posterior portion is because of this large bump from this, in this case, from this, this is called the posterior root or the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, so the posterior portion of the, in this case, of the gray matter of the actual spinal cord, and these are called horns, is normally sensory. So sensory meaning to say that they are actual sensations, okay, sensations from multiple regions of the body that actually enter, okay, and eventually, in this case, make connections, make a synapse with interneurons in this region, again, of the spinal cord. The take home here, folks, is the posterior portion is primarily sensory and the anterior portion is primarily motor, okay? And as you can see, all 4 functional areas is represented here. Somatic sensory, okay, meaning, you know, conscious sensations. Visceral sensory, meaning to say it's sensations from the organs which we are not aware of. Autonomic motor, okay, movements that we are not responsible for or that we are not aware of. And somatic, meaning to say, in this case, neurons that actually control skeletal muscle, voluntary muscles. Okay, so that's actually the architecture of the actual spinal cord. So you should be able to deduce, depending on injury, what you actually, you know, like whether like it's the posterior portion of the spinal cord that's affected or the anterior portion. Okay. Furthermore, folks, now what happens is all of this, okay, around like probably up to this region here, are still part, okay, of the central nervous system. Once the sensory divisions and the motor divisions join together, it becomes a nerve. So the difference between a nerve and a root are pure function, pure sensory or pure motor. Nerves are mixed, meaning to say they're both sensory and motor. Okay, very, very, very important. All right, so why do we care about the spinal cord? Well, the spinal cord is actually where, in this case, messages to and from the brain actually travel to. And there are 2 different types of pathways. So we have sensory pathways, sensation again, sensation pathways, and they are called ascending pathways as well. As you can see, it says ascend. Why are they called ascending pathway? It's because the messages are traveling up, or right. So ascending meaning up. Motor pathways normally come again from the brain and travel down, and that's why they call descending pathway. Note here that the last neuron for sensory pathways is in the parietal lobe. And again, this is based on the functional area of the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is responsible for general sensation. Okay, and this is actually called the sensory gyrus, if you recall. All right. Here, note that like in this case, the first. Okay, because obviously this is the last for sensory. This is the first for motor. The first neuron for the motor pathways originate from the frontal lobe, specifically from in this case, the motor gyrus of the frontal lobe. All right. Main differences here, folks, is the sensory pathway normally involves 3 neurons. Okay, tertiary, last, third, secondary neuron, and a primary neuron, whereas most motor pathways actually have 2, an upper and a lower motor neuron. There is, however, some exceptions to this. There is an indirect pathway that does require a third neuron, but most of the time, this pathway, okay, FYI, folks, actually is actually 2 neurons. Right, very, very important here. Another important thing that you could see here is we already know that the posterior portion of the spinal cord is sensory and the anterior portion is motor. And most of the tracts, okay, tracts are fasciculus, okay, and they're the pathways, okay, this is where all of those wiring, okay, or those neurons actually travel up and down the spinal cord. The other thing, folks, is I jump into a different one, is most of the sensations actually decuss. Decussation means say they cross over, and most of this 90% of all pathways decuss. Again, decuss means crossing over, and the point of decussation, again, 90% of all pathways does cross over. Decussation is also crossing over, is actually at the level of the brainstem, and the brainstem obviously is the pons, the medulla oblongata, okay, and the olives, the pyramids. Okay, so just recall, just know that very important fact. Okay, so at the brainstem level, a lot of these pathways cross over. This is one of the reasons why, you know, like when you touch something with the right hand, that signal, that sensation travels to the left side of the parietal lobe. Right? If I karate chop someone with my left hand, with my left hand, the initial motor neuron actually originates from the right side of my frontal lobe. All right. So again, very, very important distinctions. The main distinctions again is the areas of the spinal cord that most of these tracts travel through, and how many neurons actually, in this case, is actually involved between sensory and motor pathway. Right. So now we're going to talk about reflex arcs in this case. So what's a reflex arc? Reflex arcs in this case are involuntary movements which are generally required for survival. Okay. If you've ever watched the videos before in which people have been mean to cats and they throw like a, I don't know, a pickle or a cucumber at a cat, and the cat looks and sees the pickle and jumps straight up in the air, right? Well, that's a reflex. Kind of like us, right? You know, reflexes are very important because reflexes, in this case, what happens is it prevents injuries, okay, and obviously for survival, very, very important things. All right. So here is a component of reflex arc, okay, and what happens is you have a stimulus, and you can see it's a sensory neuron that actually travels to the posterior root ganglion, and obviously in this case connects with an interneuron. Interneuron actually is in the opposite side, like it's inside the spinal cord, I'm sorry. And the reason why it's called interneuron is it's between 2 neurons, right? And what happens then is there's 2 possible ways that this pathway can go. It can actually travel through, does not have to go to the brain. It goes straight through, and it goes to an effector, in this case, an effector organ, and this could be a muscle or a gland again. Or sometimes it can actually go to the brain, right? knee-jerk reflexes, well, the patellar reflex, when like a doctor actually taps at your kneecap and you actually have this kicking motion, there's actually an extension of the leg, right? The Babinski reflex for babies, in which, right, what happens, folks, is the Babinski reflex should be absent once you become an adult. Okay, so that's a very, very important thing. If you have the Babinski reflex when you're like 40, that's a problem, right? Gag reflex, okay, so we know what that is. So all of these are reflexes, and these are all important for survival. Like, let's say if something noxious enters your mouth, well, the gag reflex should, in this case, automatically kick in, and you should be able to, in this case, throw up in this case, the noxious stimulant. Okay. There are, in this case, if you count, there's 5 ways that you can classify, and all reflexes has a category on all 5. Okay. Spinal or cranial. Well, the key here is, does this reflex go all the way up to the brain, or does it stay in the spinal cord? That's where you get whether you classify something or as either spinal or cranial, somatic or visceral. If the effector is an organ, it's called visceral. If the effector is a skeletal muscle, meaning it's voluntary, it is called somatic. Okay. Now the second thing is called monosynaptic or polysynaptic. So I'm going to go back a little bit. Okay, this is a polysynaptic reflex, and the reason why is, if you look at it, synapse again is the connection between two. How many connections do you see here? You see 1, you see 2. That's polysynaptic. If there were no interneurons here, so if there was only one connection between 2 neurons, that's called monosynaptic. Okay, then the fourth one is ipsilateral or contralateral. So if I touch something with my left hand and react with the same hand, that's called ipsilateral. Ipsilateral meaning same side. If I touch something with my left hand and my right side, my right hand flinches, that's called contralateral. Okay, and actually this is a very, very important thing as well. And then, is this innate or acquired? So some reflexes are learned, that's called acquired, and some reflexes are, in this case, you're born with. All right. So now I'm not gonna go into like this whole debate about this, but again, know that this is I will probably not ask you about anything about innate or acquired in this case, but mostly over here. And more than likely, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you something like this. All right, and I'm gonna ask you, is this visceral? Is this, like, so let's actually go through this thing. Okay. So as you can see, folks, the nerve signal is related to the brain. So for the first classification, this is going to be a cranial reflex because it goes to the brain. Okay, it's a polysynaptic reflex, and the reason why it's called a polysynaptic reflex is again because you have 1 and 2 synapses. It's an ipsilateral reflex. Why? Because, folks, look at this one. It's the same side. The sensation is on the same side, right? If this was on the opposite side, this would be a contralateral reflex. All right, very, very important here. Is this somatic or visceral? This is somatic. Why is this somatic? Because the effector is a skeletal muscle. All right, so those are components of a reflex arc in this case.